Hey guys, we'll get to it here shortly. Here in a second, we're going with the 2014 FRQ questions. Hopefully, these are getting a little bit repetitive for you, and you're seeing some patterns and seeing the types of questions they're asking for a couple of reasons. Number one, that means that you're doing it. Number two, I think that it's going to prepare you greatly for some success here. All right, so we'll get to 2014 here. I'll get them all figured out and explain them real quick. We'll try to keep your time, be efficient with your time. All right, if you haven't tried those problems yet, pause the video quick, all right, and make sure you take a shot at it. So anyway, here's my answer for part A here, right? The big thing is they want us to label some things. So I got Y1 labeled here, I got price level labeled here, and then I got my full employment labeled on our long run aggregate supply there, okay? Our economy operating below full employment that way, right, of real GDP. And we also have this key information that we have a balanced budget, right? So that's going to be important later on in the problem. We haven't seen too many problems where it decides. That basically means the government's spending exactly as much money as they are collecting in taxes. Okay, so we'll have to keep that in mind as we move forward. Okay, so for part two here, it's asking us how an increase in government spending, and they mentioned 100 billion. They tell you that number again here in a second, but they mentioned that 100 billion. How it's going to affect number one, cyclical unemployment. Remember, cyclical unemployment. That's what happens when we have these business cycles, okay, where people's incomes adjust and change, and based on that, their demand for things changes, okay. And then also the natural rate of unemployment. So we're increasing spending here, all right, by $100 billion. That is going to decrease our cyclical unemployment, all right, and our natural rate of unemployment is going to be unchanged. Okay, so just to kind of clarify, remember this long run aggregate supply, we kind of compare it to unemployment because it helps us visualize what's going on down here, especially when we relate it to the Phillips curve. Okay, our natural unemployment rate's never going to change. Our long run aggregate supply curve might move one way or the other based on potential business investment and acquisition of resources, whether that be land or people or whatever. But our natural rate of unemployment, so we've got to remember loosely defined, we can look at unemployment down here and what eventually happens. But again, this natural rate of unemployment where we kind of have it, okay, it's always going to stay at a certain percentage. Usually we see about 5%, maybe a couple mentions of 4% in some of these practice problems. So that's what it's asking for you there. Okay, it's going to be unchanged due to that stimulus package of that $100 billion. All right, and just as a little tip, again, I know that they're not going to have you turn in graphs, supposedly. Okay, they're going to have you answer things probably extremely similar to what we've been doing for part B and part C right here. Okay, but I'm going to keep that graph there simply because I'm going to be able to reference it. I get comfortable. It's going to kind of hopefully walk me into some answers if I get stuck. Okay, so we've got this 100 billion. They give us some statistics here. They give us the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, which we need to know that the marginal propensity to save is 0.25. All right, it's going to access the amount of change in real GDP can result from that $100 billion stimulus. So our multiplier, 1 over marginal propensity to save equals 4. Okay, so we're going to take 100 billion times 4, and your answer is $400 billion. All right, and that's what it's asking you to figure out for part C. I did put the tax multiplier in there just because we are going to need it later. Remember, the tax multiplier is simply our spending multiplier minus 1. You can also get there by saying marginal propensity to consume divided by the marginal propensity to save, and in that case, it's also 3. So you can do one or the other, whatever works for you. For me, I like to use minus 1. All right, for part D here, we've got to go back to our original question where it says, assume the United States economy is currently operating below full employment, GDP of real GDP, and with a balanced budget. Okay, so again, if you feel like you don't know something, don't be afraid to go back and read something from beforehand. So that balanced budget was occurring before Part C's $100 billion stimulus. So if the budget was balanced, we know the government's going to have to borrow money now to be able to give people those funds. Okay. And so if the government kind of changes, right, they have new plans, they have new programs to put in place that changes the demand, overall demand for loanable funds, right? The government has to increase their demand for loanable funds. And eventually that's going to show us here that interest rates are going to increase. Okay. Fiscal policy affects the demand side of loanable funds. Monetary policy affects the supply side of loanable funds in the money market in the money market graph, right? So anyway, you should have an increase in demand. You should also say that interest rates are going to increase. All right. They don't have you explain it. Again, you've kind of got a situation where it's going to be a 50-50 shot. Okay. Don't be afraid to take guesses. All righty. When you get to some of these. All righty. All right, party. They're asking you what's going to happen to long run economic growth. We've tied in that economic growth into our long run aggregate supply, right? And we need to be able to acquire more resources. We need to be able to build more capital with machines or whatever. And the way that businesses do that is by borrowing money. So what you need to tie in here is that economic growth will slow in the long run, okay, or be less in the long run. Due to less business investment because of those higher interest rates, okay, is what you want to tie into. All right, we'll do part F here in a second. I'm going to get something written down for you and see if I can't explain it clearly, okay, a little bit tricky. Okay, so for part F here, I'd be lying to you if I didn't say that I had to look up the answer. My initial thought was that things would stay the same, and that since, I might be getting $100 billion in my pocket, but I'm also getting $100 billion taken out. And so my initial answer was incorrect. And so I had to look up at what the answer was. Okay, so first of all, I kind of went the long way through this to help explain it. Okay, so we know the spending multiplier was already $400 billion. We know that. All right, we had that up in part C, I believe. All right, well, we've mentioned the tax multiplier as we were up there. So the way that I'd wrap my head around this is we have a decrease, right? A multiplier. We have a negative multiplier. We're getting money taken out of our pockets. Rather than getting a tax into our pockets, we're getting money taken out of our pockets. So we can have a negative number here. We've never talked about that, but we could put a negative number here. So I put negative 100 billion, and then I put my tax multiplier. And so that ends us up with negative $300 billion. Okay. And so the initial question is, right, assume the financing of the $100 billion to increase in government spending by borrowing. The United States also increases taxes by $100 billion. With that equal increase in government spending and taxes, will the real GDP increase, decrease, or remain the same? Okay, so with that math, 400 minus 300 billion, right, we still have a total increase in GDP of $100 billion. Okay, so the answer that they want is that it's going to increase, and the website shows that it's going to increase because, and all they said is the tax multiplier is smaller than the spending multiplier. Okay, so again, something maybe a little bit new that we haven't quite seen. Okay, a little bit of a curveball that they throw you in terms of something that may be a little bit new. Okay. All right, number 2, starting us off here. Part A is assume that the Federal Reserve targets a lower federal funds rate, okay? And what's that going to do? What open market operation is the Federal Reserve going to use to achieve that lower target? So their open market operation is they're going to buy bonds, right? They're going to make the economy bigger. They want people to borrow more money. They're going to buy bonds. Okay. Now, part A2 here is a little bit tricky because we've got to figure out, remember, the government's the one buying things, right? So remember, in these open market operations, when the government buys bonds, they've got to give money to banks and rich people, basically, right? So how do we convince bankers, okay, and rich people to sell us those bonds? All right. Well, the price of the bonds have got to increase. It's a backwards way of thinking. Okay, the price of the bonds need to increase. Remember, the government's trying to sell them, right? Or I'm sorry, the government's trying to buy them, right? And so how do I convince somebody to sell me something? All right, I'm going to raise the price that I'm going to sell it for. Okay, so it's a little bit of a backwards way of thinking, all right? but the price of the bonds have to increase because the government is buying them, right? So how do I convince the seller to sell it? I've got to increase the price of the bonds. All right. Another way to think of it is, again, when a bank's holding these assets, right, or any individual is holding these assets, all right, if I don't sell those assets, I'm giving something up. Okay. So when that price goes up, the opportunity cost of me holding on to those things, okay, also increases. It's another way of thinking about things. All right. And I know we didn't touch base on it too much, but that is the answer that they're looking for. Like I said, it is a little bit backwards. Hopefully we see it a couple times here, okay, and we can kind of get used to what's going on. But it can be a tricky way of thinking. All right, don't get too discouraged. Remember, you can miss a couple of these and still have an extraordinary amount of success. So don't get too discouraged if you're missing a couple. Again, the idea is we're trying to give you tools for your tool belt that you can use as we move forward into the test taking process. Okay, part B. Hopefully you're getting to the point now. If we need people to borrow money, we want people to spend money, we've got to lower interest rates, right? Monetary policy affects the supply, right? So our interest rates are going to decrease, all right? They don't have you explain that. So we should be pretty good with that. All right, part C. Remember, there's three tools monetary policy uses. They've got the reserve requirements, they've got the federal funds rate, okay, or the discount rate, and they've also got the open market operations. So part two here, they kind of throw you a little bit of a curveball because they're saying they're buying these bonds. So they're saying what they've done. We've done this. And then it says, what's that going to do to the required reserves in a bank? Well, that's not going to change anything. Okay. The required reserves are going to stay whatever they're at unless the government announces that they're going to change those things. So just a little bit of a different kind of a curveball in terms of what they try to do to you. And remember, all three of those things are separate: the interest rates, the buying and selling of bonds, and the reserve requirements. Okay, so for part number 2, part D, things get real specific. And we didn't spend a whole bunch of time talking about these two things, okay? So the federal funds rate is going to be a rate that the Federal Reserve is trying to hit. Okay, so let's just say interest rates are 5% in the free market, right? That banks are offering, and the government says no, we want the federal funds rate to be at like 4.5%. Okay, that's how they're going to implement their policy. And again, if I'm saying I want a lower interest rate, then I'm going to say that I'm implementing loose money policy, right? It's expansionary policy. So we didn't really mention this. We might have thrown it out there real quick, but that is what they are referring to. The discount rate is what banks have to pay to borrow money from each other, including the Federal Reserve. Okay, so this is that third option, or this is with the second option we talked about, right? So you've got number 1, reserve requirements. You've got number 2, change the discount rate. And then number 3 are your open market operations. Right. So those are the three things. We talked about this. We didn't really, we defined it as the amount, we use it as looking at the penalty that I have to pay for if I loan out too much money, right? That's what this is referring to. We don't usually call it the discount rate. They use some specific language there, but this is that second way that we said, hey, listen, we kind of compared it to the speed limit. Right. And we said, hey, listen, if the penalty was really low, people are going to speed more often. If this is really low, we're going to loan out a whole lot more money, right? Get real close to that reserve requirement and not be afraid to loan out too much because the penalty won't be very much. Okay. On the flip side, if it was $1,000 every speeding ticket you got, you'd speed a lot less. Right. And so anyway, just kind of some specific terms there. Okay. In terms of maybe things that you might see. Hoping that the review's doing good. Okay. And again, I think that anytime that you prepare for a test like this, you're going to see some things that you haven't touched too much on. And, that's why we're doing it right now. Okay. Number 3 here coming shortly. Okay, so you know what to do everything with number three here. It's just, it's just, and I don't even know if you have to do any of it. I don't know if they would talk like this or not. But I thought that, you know what, we talked about, we can figure out these answers for 3A and 3B number two. Okay, so anyway, we've got a situation. The zero account balance, they won't use that language in the test. That is that unit six stuff that we're not doing. Okay. But they do say that the inflation rate in the United States goes down, okay, relative to inflation in South Korea. So basically, it's saying that, listen, South Korea products are getting expensive. United States products stay cheap. Okay. South Korea, what they want you to say is South Korea is going to buy more stuff from the United States. All right. So, based on the decrease in inflation rate in the U.S., the United States exports to South Korea will increase. Okay. So, our exports will increase. Okay. And then B1, sorry, that's talking about an account, current account balance. We didn't do that. Okay. And then B2, it says what's going to happen to the real GDP in the U.S. in the short run. Well, if South Koreans are buying all of our stuff, right, our GDP is going to increase. Okay, so hopefully you're able to figure those out. Pretty straightforward there. Okay, just kind of, it's basically talking about your shifters of your aggregate demand curve. All right. Keep grinding these out. Okay. Days are running out on us, obviously, and we'll keep moving forward. We'll see you on Friday, and hopefully, you're getting these done. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have some specific questions. If you did not get through and do that practice test, make sure that you do that. I've got a couple emails that said, "Hey, I struggle with this," with some suggestions. They made sure that it was nice for them to see way beforehand some of the loopholes you'd have to jump through, or some of the hiccups of the program and attaching files and things like that. So don't be afraid to contact with questions.